guys have big smiles.
Yeah, that looks really good. If you can do that. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Allison, and I have been homeschooling my 8, 6, and 3-year-old for 8 months. We chose to go with classical education because a big part of it is teaching kids how to learn and not what to learn. I say that, but I should clarify that it doesn't mean that we don't tell them what to learn, because obviously we have books that we use and subjects that we force upon them. But it's not like public education where you are concerned with hitting certain benchmarks by a certain time, and the curriculum is set by a large board when you're in a public education setting. And with us, we can basically choose subjects that we find interesting, things that we think are important to becoming well-rounded adults, as opposed to checking off boxes on someone else's list. One thing that I always kind of in a guilty fashion like to preface when I'm talking about homeschooling, preface this whole conversation with, is the fact that we feel incredibly privileged to be able to do this with our kids. A lot of people say, well, I can't do that. I have to work a job, or I don't have the time, or I don't have the patience, and all of that is totally fine. I don't consider people who send their kids to traditional schools to be getting any less of an education. It's just a different kind of education. I feel very fortunate that we are able to homeschool. We are able to survive on one income, and I am home with the kids and really do enjoy working with them. One of the big motivators for us is that we actually like hanging out with our kids. It seems silly to say that, but I know a lot of parents feel like they couldn't possibly spend all day with their kids. By breakfast time, they're already had it up to here with the kids, and they just need to get them out of the house for a few hours. And while I definitely feel that way about my kids pretty much every single day, I also realized that when I was working and the kids were going to public school, I felt like garbage at the end of the day, because I would spend max 2 hours with my kids. They were exhausted. They really didn't want to do anything other than veg out in front of the TV because their poor little brains had been running ragged all day. And that sucked. We didn't like that. I hated the idea that the weekends were the only time that we had with our kids, and we had to fit in having fun with our kids in between doing laundry and cleaning the house and visiting with family and friends. And so we just decided to say, forget it. Take the kids out of school. We get to spend as much time with them as we want. One of the biggest things that you'll see on homeschooling forums is flexibility. The flexibility of homeschooling probably, for me, even rises above the fact that I like hanging out with my kids and want them home. Flexibility is key. I love that on any given day, if my kids wake up and they start building some ridiculous Lego project in the living room, and they're having awesome sibling time, and they're laughing and having a great time, I don't have to say, oh my God, it's 7:30. You need to get your shoes on. It's time. Did you eat any breakfast? We got to get out the door. I can just basically take a step back, take my cup of coffee, and slink away into the distance and let them experience being kids. They have quality time with their siblings and time to be creative with their toys. And I think that that's more important than trying to rush them out the door to be on time for someone else's timeline. Shout out to teachers. I will defend you all till the end. What you do is absolutely amazing, and being in a room all day with 30 people's children that are not your own is not only crazy to me, but honestly deserves $100,000 per year. I can barely stand my own kids some days. Classical education is pretty important to us because it teaches our kids how to analyze information and draw conclusions about what they're learning. But when they are at an age that they are now of 8 and 6 years old, our 3-year-old honestly doesn't do a whole lot at this point, we are just kind of cramming information down their throats. Cramming information down their throats doesn't sound like something that a lot of people would say that they want to subject their kids to, but honestly what it's about is just filling their minds with as much information as possible, as many words as possible. With classical education, it's pretty history-centric. You actually start in the ancient history and work your way until modern times, and a lot of the information is rooted out of history. They consider it pretty important that you work your way through human history in a natural timeline, showing how things actually played out. In public education, a lot of times what they will do is they will choose a region of the world and you learn a bunch of stuff about that. So, now we're going to be learning about Europe. All right, let's start with ancient Europe and work our way up until last Tuesday. That really doesn't give kids any kind of perspective on what is happening globally at the time. Probably one of the most embarrassing things that I can admit is that Brian and I did not realize that Caesar and Jesus were somewhat contemporaries. When I read that in our history book, I actually had to admit that to Brian, and then fortunately he admitted that he was just as stupid as I am. I mentioned Jesus and Caesar in the same sentence, which I know for anyone that knows Brian and I personally might make them a bit curious. We have found that, yes, lots of homeschooling curriculum, websites, people, etc., do come from a religious background. So there is a little bit of wading through that I've had to do when choosing certain things like science books. But we are not opposed to teaching those things to our kids. In fact, Sagan, our 8-year-old, is super keen on Buddha ever since we touched on him in our ancients textbook. But you don't have to teach any of those things. There are plenty of secular books out there. Classical education can lean towards the religious, but honestly, you can skip that if that's something you're not into. Or if you're into it, actually, the Christians have basically taken classical education, created an entire program all for themselves. And if it wasn't for the fact that I would have had to sign a document stating that Jesus is my Lord and personal Savior in order to be able to join those co-ops, I probably would have joined them. For example, in the Ancients text, it does get into a couple of Bible stories. They do, even though it's in a history book, it also includes things like the Epic of Gilgamesh. So they include lots of things in the historical texts that are painted as mythologies, stories that influence the time or kind of explain the times. So naturally, you're going to touch on Jesus and the Bible. Personally, what I chose to do is when I would get to those points, it was a little confusing for my kids because when they would hear about things like, I think Noah may have been one of them, one of them stopped me and said, "Is this history or is this?" And I said, "Well, this is Christian mythology. Just like we studied Greek mythology 5 chapters ago, now we're talking about Christian mythology. These are stories. Some of it may be rooted in some fact, but really these are just stories that give us a better picture about the time." So this is my version of the Bible. This is the Welltrained Mind by Jessie Wise and Susan Wise Bauer. Jessie Wise is Susan's mom who homeschooled her, and then Susan went on to homeschool her own kids. Susan Wise Bauer was taught with the classical method, but she didn't know what that meant at the time. It wasn't until she got older that she found out that the method of teaching that was used on her actually had a name. And since her background is in literature, she went on to write this book, which has become kind of the cornerstone of everything classical education. As you can see, I've got a ton of little flags and Post-its and things, and I refer to it on a regular basis to make sure that I'm staying on track. In the Welltrained Mind, she not only gives you step-by-step instructions on how to pull off teaching your kids with the classical method, there are book lists and different curriculum that you can choose from, but also she talks about the trivium. The trivium is a 3-part process of training the mind on how to learn. Grades 1 through 4, you work through the grammar stage. The grammar stage is the first 4 years, and during that time, you are introducing kids to basically the building blocks of education. You're going to be walking them through all of the information that they need to learn to inform all of the later stages of education. During this time, you read as much as you can to them. You just try to fill their heads with as many names, people, places, things, read through a lot of classical literature, and just expose them to as many ideas as possible. Honestly, at this point, they are not going to remember a good chunk of it, but I will tell you that even though my kids can't give you a whole lot of specific details about ancient Egypt, every single time they see something about Mesopotamia in a book or online, or they see the Mediterranean Sea, just the fact that we learned all about all of the different cultures that were sprouting up around the Mediterranean Sea. Every time that comes up on television, a movie, and a book, the kids get really excited because it's something they're familiar with. So if you ask them where the Mediterranean Sea is or any specifics about it, I'll be honest, they probably can't tell you much. But it's just like when an adult hears something for the first time and then suddenly you see it everywhere. When they learn a lot of information in the grammar stage, even if they don't fully understand it, it allows them to have those aha moments when they become exposed to those same words and topics and phrases in other media. So I said this is a 3-part process called the trivium. The first part is the grammar stage, which is just filling their minds with as much interesting, beautiful knowledge and language as possible. And the second step is the logic stage. Logic stage typically runs from about the 5th grade until about the end of 8th grade. And the logic stage is where they start to take the different information that they've learned and they start putting those things together. So they've been learning about science, they've been learning possibly another language, they are learning history. And in the logic stage, you take all of that information and you put it together and start to create an organizational scheme in their heads where they see how all of the different subjects actually work together. So you're taking history and you're revisiting it with science and you're saying, okay, these are the scientific discoveries that were happening at the same time of history. And you start layering everything together. And that's when they start to see the cause and effect of the different subjects working together and see the relationship between the different bodies of knowledge. The third part is the rhetoric stage. Rhetoric stage falls typically around the high school ages, so 9th through 12th grade. In homeschooling, we don't really count grades, but I'll get to that later. For the rhetoric stage, once you hit that point, that is the part that I'm most looking forward to, because that is when you take all of the information that the student has learned, and they should be able to take all that knowledge from the grammar stage, put it together in a logical way in the logic stage, and then now in the rhetoric stage, they need to be able to recite and recount that information in a way that's coherent, interesting, and can show that they have been absorbing all of this information. The rhetoric stage is where specialization takes place, and the student can start deciding which of the subjects they've been learning for the past 8 years really pique their interest. That way, you're not stopping math with someone just because they're not interested in it or completely cutting off literature, but you start propping up their interests and you can start taking kind of a slower pace with the ones that they're not as interested in and don't seem to be forwarding their potential career path in the future. One of the biggest criticisms that we get from some of our friends when we explain classical education to them is they want to know, where is the creativity, where's the creative play at this level. The kids get plenty of creative play on their own time. In school, we are trying to expose them to as much information as possible so that they can be more creative later in life. It goes against what a lot of people believe. They think you should really be giving kids all the tools to sit down and paint pictures and write loose stories. Being creative requires knowledge. You need to have ideas and resources to draw from in your brain to be creative and to create interesting things. We've found that when we go over certain subjects with our kids, that is what works its way into their play. And that is a much more organic, interesting type of creativity than just giving them paint and telling them, paint me a pretty picture, and they just draw the same trees over and over and over again. For instance, one day I walked outside and the 3 of my kids were wielding sticks and screaming at the top of their lungs and just being lunatics. And I said, "What are you guys doing?" And they said, "We're ancient Mesopotamians and we're fighting." And they had basically taken what we talked about in history that week and they had taken it on as a persona. So they're already using what they've learned in their creative play. Another common criticism about homeschooling is that your kids will somehow miss out on quality time with their peers. I think peers are great. Peers are people that they should have in their lives, but I think that when you take a small kid, or really anybody at any age, and put them only with people of their own age, that stifles growth, learning potential, things that could happen from being around people who are not only smarter than them, older than them, as well as kids who are younger than they are and at an earlier stage of their education. Our kids have always had exposure to older adults through Brian being in the theater and us always being the nosy neighbors who are banging on people's doors and trying to make friends and have barbecues. And I think that that served our kids well. They do not have a problem with interacting with adults of any age. They are curious. They have the ability to approach an adult and speak to them on a level that I think that some kids miss out on when their only exposure are their peers.